Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Wednesday, it's April 16th, 2025, and today is day 558. I'm coming to you tonight from Jerusalem with an update from the last 24 hours. In Gaza, the number of people who were killed at the Al-Tufa increased from 10 to the Hus from one particular family. Their name was the Hasuna family, including the photographer Fatima Hasuna, who's become a regular contributor to international news coverage on Gaza because of her photographs of the ongoing war and atrocities happening there. There are many other updates that I could give about Gaza, including how desperate the situation is there in terms of food, the declaration of the Israeli security establishment to continue to press down on the people of Gaza. The death toll over the last 24 hours was again more than 20 people. Our work is focusing on ending all of the violence in the Middle East, and it is currently the most acute in Gaza. And yet the same practices that are happening there of forced displacement and ethnic cleansing are also happening in the occupied West Bank. There, unprecedented levels of violence, severe movement restrictions, and the cancellation of 180,000 permits to work in Israel and its settlements have triggered a severe humanitarian crisis in the West Bank. I'm not talking about Gaza. So it's important for us to not forget that the challenges Palestinians face certainly include the ongoing incursions of the Israeli military, the suffocating reality that the majority of the population in Gaza, more than 2 million people, are living in roughly a third of the territory of the Gaza Strip. They're living under daily bombardment and war. And the West Bank is also being squeezed because of settlement expansion, because of home demolitions, because of increased checkpoints. There are currently more than 900 checkpoints throughout the Palestinian territories within the West Bank. That includes East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank. In Israel, Israeli troops have said that they're going to remain in, quote, security zones in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria indefinitely. You'll recall that there are 5 particular locations where the Israeli military continues to remain in South Lebanon. Part of the ceasefire agreement is that Israel would completely withdraw from south of the border and that Hezbollah would withdraw north of the Litani River. So that's a violation of that ceasefire agreement. The Palestinians and both neighboring countries view the Israeli military's presence as an occupation in violation of international law. That's the Associated Press. In Jerusalem, Israeli settlers under escort by the Israeli police are currently celebrating at Lions Gate in the Old City. This is news from today. There was loud music blaring from their cars. A Palestinian youth was assaulted and arrested yesterday at At-Tur, which is it's a neighborhood on the Mount of Olives. And Israeli settlers have carried out multiple incursions for Jewish rituals in front of the Cotton's Gate after Israeli forcible closure of shops in the area. Israeli settlers officially took control over the Petra Hotel and Omar bin Al-Khattab Square at Jaffa Gate. Jordan yesterday said that it arrested 13 citizens with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood conspiring to manufacture and launch rockets within the kingdom. In a statement, the Muslim Brotherhood's Jordanian branch disavowed any connection to the alleged plots. Those plots were actually towards Jordan, and those citizens were arrested. The U.S. military is set to consolidate its presence in Syria in a move that could cut the number of troops there in half in coming months, U.S. officials announced. And apparently, President Trump yesterday held a meeting on the U.S. position on the ongoing nuclear deal negotiations with Iran at the White House in the Situation Room. So that's according to sources. I read that and I was like, that can't be right. There was the whole question about whether or not the negotiations with Iran that were happening in Oman over the weekend, were those going to be direct or indirect negotiations? And it was reported that Steve Witkoff had a very brief direct interaction after those discussions. But apparently today there were deal negotiations with Iran at the White House in the Situation Room. The Office of Management and Budget proposed eliminating funding for the UN peacekeeping missions. So peacekeeping missions, UNIFIL, these are some of the groups that are active in South Lebanon. So this really can affect various parts, certainly of the world, but also Lebanon, specifically in the Middle East. And it was announced recently that Jonathan Greenblatt, he's the CEO and national director of the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL. He was just named the list that Time Magazine, of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2025. So I wanted to just take a brief moment and say what the ADL says about him, and then a response to that. The ADL describes themselves as nonpartisan, and they say they fight anti-Semitism. Now, many groups disagree and say that's not true. I mean, they affirmed Elon Musk and others who've been criticized for anti-Semitic comments and actions. But the ADL says that they combat anti-Semitism, extremism, and all forms of hate, regardless of ideology or party. The ADL sometimes comes under criticism, this is their words, from both sides of the political spectrum. Some critics charge that we're leaning too far in combating extremism, while others call to question the methodology of combating anti-Semitism. And at times, other critics claim the ADL is an organization of the right, declaring that it should not be permitted in progressive spaces, or they single the ADL out for our strong support and visible advocacy of Israel. Now, if they stand up against all forms of hatred, I would hope that it includes everyone, the Arab Americans, Palestinians, etc. I want you to hear the response by the Institute for Middle East Understanding. This is IMEU. One of the arguments against the ADL is that they conflate the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of the state of Israel. So IMEU says this about ADL. As a part of the backing for Israel, the ADL attacks and smears defenders of Palestinian rights in the U.S., including students groups, the Movement for Black Lives, and progressive Jewish groups like Jewish Voices for Peace and If Not Now, pushing schools, the federal, state, and local governments to suppress their activities. So I would encourage you to read about the ADL yourself. Read what the IMEU says, read what the ADL says, and form your own opinion. But IMEU summarizes how problematic their views are towards Arab Americans, the Middle East, and Palestine. According to a Hebrew news channel, since the beginning of last week, the United States has intensified its supply of munitions to Israel via an airlift of transport aircraft. Departing from American bases in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East, dozens of C-17 transport planes have landed at the Nevatim Air Base. This is just in recent days. And according to this report today, for example, 6 planes landed carrying Mk-84 heavy bombs. Those, I would presume, are the bombs that Biden put on hold, 200-pound bombs, heavy ammunition, and other munitions intended for the continued fighting in Gaza. And as a part of the preparations for a possible U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran should negotiations fail, the aircraft also carry missiles for the U.S. THAAD defense system. In addition, Business Insider reported that U.S. military planes flew a Patriot Air Defense Battalion out of the Pacific and to the Middle East, and that took more than 70 different flights. Okay, let's see where I was. I wanted to give you an update on Harvard's situation. There's been a battle between some of these academic institutions, Columbia and Harvard, that have had these pro-Palestinian protests. The Trump administration said that they did not respond adequately to the anti-Semitism on campus. And I do hear that there have been some horrific acts of anti-Semitism on campus. So I am not minimizing that in any way. However, there is a conflation where pro-Palestinian protests are being equated to pro-Hamas protests, and that is not the same thing. Harvard had the title of this article is from Al Jazeera, and it says Harvard's $2.3 billion gamble, what Trump demanded and how the university resisted. So Harvard actually is not backing down against President Trump, unlike Columbia, which made a deal. So a month after Columbia buckled to Trump's demands, Harvard says it will not accept them, and $2.3 billion is on the line. You can read details about that and how it unfolded in numerous outlets. I know Al Jazeera reported on it. Trump also, as a response, threatened Harvard's tax-exempt status. So this just happened Tuesday. He floated the idea of revoking Harvard's tax-exempt status, an escalation of the funding fight between the federal government and the Ivy League school. The Middle East Forum came out with a report that was talking about funds that have been lost from Israeli and Jewish-owned businesses as a result of pro-Palestinian protests in the U.S. And listen to this, they're thinking of using, or there are plans, and they're using civil RICO, R-I-C-O, laws to try to recoup these losses. Now, my husband had explained to me the fundamentals of what RICO means. It stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And the Middle East Forum said that today we feature a report that they put together on using civil RICO as a remedy to recover some of the $1.51 billion in economic damages caused by anti-Israel protests across the U.S. Now, I had to think about it. What damage are these anti-Israel protests? I mean, I would say pro-Palestinian protests. I mean, some may very well be very anti-Israel, but what are the protests? What's this all about? This is about the protests calling for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And so the result of those is the loss of $1.51 billion. Of that total, 1.19 billion is from lost revenue, particularly from Jewish-owned and Israeli-linked businesses. We provide an assessment, so this is the Middle East Forum, for a legal roadmap of how these RICO claims can be applied. For affected businesses, civil RICO offers a potential legal remedy. So if organizations or institutions boycott an Israeli-owned company, RICO could allow them to recover their losses and economic damages by, I presume RICO is applied to the person who caused the lost damages. I didn't read the whole report in terms of the specifics. But despite high evidentiary requirements, successful RICO claims could yield treble damages, 3 times the damages, targeting organizations coordinating disruptive protests. So this is specifically, if you protest, call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and you're successful, you can be subject to this RICO charges. The Middle East Forum's calling for the documentation of protests and urging businesses to document incidents thoroughly to explore legal options while policymakers balance free speech protections with support for affected communities. Now, that free speech protections, that's where Churches for Middle East Peace stands. It's important to clear. We need to be clear. We don't support the damage of any property. We don't support violent protests. But we do absolutely support the right of the democratic process and right to engage in protests. I mean, this is a fundamental American right. The rights of Americans to engage also in positive investments. Where do you want to spend your money or to divest from organizations or interests based on your personal beliefs? In other words, if individuals or organizations decide to boycott Israeli businesses, they could be vulnerable according to RICO laws. And that's a violation of fundamental democratic rights. Now, as I said, I haven't read the specifics of the report, but I want to remind you, it was ultimately boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is a nonviolent mechanism of protest. BDS was what brought down the anti-apartheid regime in South Africa. Churches for Middle East Peace's policy on this is that in order to defend free speech and religious liberty, we uphold the right of churches and organizations to find appropriate and various ways to end unjust practices and policies that violate international laws and conventions, including exerting economic leverage on commercial and government actors. Now, what that means is our denominations are very diverse on their perspectives towards BDS, but we absolutely support the right for groups to be able to engage in this nonviolent mechanism. A few congressional updates. On April 6th, the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions announced that they were postponing the hearing and vote that was originally scheduled for April 9th, which is on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2025. That has 40 bipartisan co-sponsors. Now, that is one of the acts that is seeking to define anti-Semitism in correlation, as criticism of the state of Israel could be defined as anti-Semitism. Citing the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973, 3 U.S. representatives, Jayapal, Ro Khanna, and Val Hoyle, they're all expressing major concerns over the fact that Congress did not approve the U.S. military strikes in Yemen. So what they're saying is this is a violation of the War Powers Act. The U.S. Constitution is clear. Congress is the only one that can declare war. While we share concerns about maritime security in the Red Sea, we call on the administration to immediately cease unauthorized use of military force and instead to seek specific statutory authorization from Congress before involving the U.S. in an unconstitutional conflict in the Middle East, which risks endangering U.S. military personnel in the region and escalating it into a regime change war. So I've been talking about this. The U.S. has been bombing the Houthis in Yemen for weeks. We have killed at least 24 people. I don't have that exact number, but just counting how many times I've said 9 people or 10 people just in the last few days, it's at least 24 people. In addition, on April 7th, Senators Welch from Vermont and Van Hollen from Maryland have questioned the Trump administration on the U.S.'s liability for aiding and abetting Netanyahu's potential war crimes. They sent a letter, and Welch posted on X, when Netanyahu says he wants to bomb everything, we should believe him. Enough is enough. I'm asking the Trump administration with Senator Van Hollen why the U.S. is giving more bombs to Israel when they are being used illegally. We would concur and stand beside Senators Welch and Van Hollen in that regard. If you've not read CMEP's statement on the bombing of Ali Hospital, the Christian Anglican hospital in Gaza that happened on Palm Sunday, we encourage you to do so. Today, we issued an action alert about that, talking about how CMEP condemns all acts of violence, acts of violence by Hamas and other militant groups and acts of violence by the Israeli military, and calls on an immediate end to the bloodshed. In the wake of the mass destruction and threats to human life, it's vital that Congress hear from their constituents that we support a swift de-escalation of violence, a call to a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire, and an end to sending U.S. weapons to Israel because they're being used in violation of international law. So tell your members of Congress to act now in support of a comprehensive ceasefire in Gaza, to end the displacement of the Palestinian people, and to prioritize human life, all life. Palestinian, Israeli, all human beings. Might God go before us in these efforts towards peace, the protection of human life, and our pursuit of lasting solutions to the ongoing violence in the West Bank, Gaza, and wherever it may be in the Middle East and in the world. In the name of the Prince of Peace, amen.